Hi, everyone. We're just waiting for a couple of people to filter in. We'll get started in a minute or so. Welcome, everyone, so far. All right, so we're going to make a start. It's 10:01. So a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us for this Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network meeting. Thank you so much all for coming. For those of you who are new to the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network, the VAM is a research network that aims to reduce the prevalence of violence, abuse, and associated mental health problems by bringing together experts with different ways of thinking about violence, abuse, and mental health. And this includes academics, healthcare practitioners, policymakers, and people with lived experience of these issues. We currently have over 1,200 members signed up to the network. And the Violence, Abuse, Mental Health Network runs a variety of different activities, including hosting webinars and developing resources and providing grant funding for research. My name is Charlie Pafitas, and I'm taking over from Sean Oram on the leadership team of the Violence, Abuse, and Mental Health Network, while Sean is off on maternity leave. So it's really nice to meet everyone here today. I'm a survivor of childhood and adolescent domestic violence, and for the last 11 years, I've worked at Rhodes University in South Africa and at King's College London, developing community-based participatory research to strengthen community resilience and developing interventions to improve the mental health of survivors of violence. So please introduce yourselves in the chat and feel free to share any resources that you might like to share with other members throughout the webinar. The chat is there for that purpose. And I'm just going to briefly run through the agenda for today. We're going to start off where I'm going to make an announcement about the VAM's new arts grant competition, which is really exciting. So I'll quickly run through that with you all, and I'll just share some slides. And then we're going to have a presentation and panel on research at trauma, which will run from around 10:20 to 11. And at 11, we'll have a quick comfort break for 10 minutes. And after that, we'll go on to a keynote speech by Abby Shepherd-Fields, Sophie Nami, and Liz Dartnell from the Sexual Violence Research Initiative leadership team. And that presentation will last for around 20 minutes. And then we'll have some questions from the audience, and we'll run through those until we end at around 12 o'clock. So it's a really exciting session that we have today for this network meeting, and I'm really looking forward to all of the talks that we're going to have today. We'll be asking questions from you to the speakers at the end of their talks. So please write those in the Q&A box down below. You'll see there's two bubbles. One is a chat box where you can talk about yourselves and share links. And the other one is a Q&A box. So please post your questions to the panelists and the speakers in that bubble, the Q&A one, and we'll be able to see them really easily then and share them with our speakers. We're also going to be live tweeting this event, so please follow along and also tag us in any of your tweets at VAM, VAMHN. And also we're recording this webinar today, and we'll be sharing all of the slides that come up after the event on our website, and we'll send out an email with the links to those after the event. So that's all of the housekeeping that we have for this morning. Again, if anyone has just joined us now, a very, very warm welcome to you, and we're really looking forward to having you all at this network meeting. So it's very exciting. I'm going to move on now to announce our new arts competition from the VAM. It's our fourth small grants competition. So I've got some slides that I'd like to share with you to do that, and I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So bear with me for a second while I do that. Right, there we go. Can everyone see my screen? A thumbs up.
Yep, all good.
Great, thanks, Anjali. Super. So the activities of the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network in years 1 and 2 and 3 focused on measurement, understanding, and interventions. And as we're now moving into our fourth year, our activities are really going to be focused on understanding, engagement, and collaboration. And within this broader theme, we're really delighted to announce our fourth small grant competition, calling for researcher-artist collaborations to develop innovative and creative approaches to engaging society about violence, abuse, and mental health that have the potential to significantly enhance public understanding and centering lived experience. So I'm going to run through today what we're looking for in this grant and what's on offer. So what are we looking for? We're looking for researcher-artist collaborations that engage the wider public around violence, abuse, and mental health. And we're looking for innovative projects with the potential for high quality and original outputs, which generate new critical perspectives and inspire further discussion around violence, abuse, and mental health. All projects need to include a lead artist and a lead academic and ensure that lived experience engagement is included as central in the project. Projects really need to harness lived experience in order to generate new knowledge or data relating to violence, abuse, and mental health, engage the wider public with the work, and have the potential to significantly enhance the public understanding of these issues through the projects that are undertaken. It's expected that final works are produced and public engagement activities are included in all of the projects proposed, not added on after the events. And projects need to include plans to really evaluate the success of the public engagement activities that are undertaken. And what's on offer? Well, we anticipate funding around 3 to 5 projects with between 10 and 15,000 pounds for 6 to 9 month projects. And we need those projects to be concluded by the 31st of January 2023 in line with the VAMH deadlines. So the deadline for applications for submitting your project proposals is the 4th of March 2022 at 5 o'clock. So you see we've given quite a long lead time on developing these proposals because they require quite a lot of collaboration, which you might not already have. And we'll run through how we're going to help you set up those collaborations in a minute. We're looking for quite specific approaches for this call, and we're quite open to what people do. We think projects could be delivered online or offline or using mixed methods. And what we're looking for, possibly amongst other things, are arts experiences, which are tested through small focus groups, illustrative projects which share and communicate new knowledge arising from academic research or artistic practice and invite audiences' responses and feedback, or interactive projects which give participants new critical perspectives on violence, abuse, and mental health, or participatory projects which enhance understanding and offer new perspectives through the engagement of communities in the creation of new work, or a combination of any of these types of approaches. The applications really need to demonstrate how your proposal is grounded in an arts-based approach. And we've defined art really broadly and given a couple of things that might be included in an artistic approach, such as painting, graphic design, illustration, sculpture, literature, film, music, theater, fashion, textiles, new media art, street art, graffiti. So keeping it really, really broad. But of course, this is not what it's limited to. Any argument you can put forward to about an artistic practice not listed here would also be very welcomed. There are some key questions from discussions that we've had, previous research that we've undertaken with McPinn Foundation, with people with lived experience of violence, abuse, and mental health that haven't fully been addressed in the previous rounds of grant funding from the VAMH. And these questions lend themselves particularly well to researcher-artist collaborations. And I've put these questions up here on this slide. You can take some time to go through them as you look at the slides when they're sent around. But these are the questions that have come up in the report from the VAMH and the McPinn Foundation. And you can read more about these lived experience priorities in research on our website. These questions are obviously not an exhaustive list, and applicants are welcome to explore any of the areas outlined in the original priorities report that comes from our research with people with lived experience. Now, we recognize that artists and researchers are not always well linked to one another, and we're asking for you to collaborate in this grant competition call. So to help with this, in December and January, VAMH will be hosting online events to facilitate connections and introductions between artists and researchers and people with lived experience. And these events will allow artists, academics, and people with lived experience to learn more about each other and to connect with one another and to hear about each other's work and interests. And so I've put up on this slide when these networking events will be held. The first one will be on the 15th of December, and the second one will be on the 21st of January. You can find out more about these by emailing us at vam@kcl.ac.uk. And the events are also listed on Eventbrite with some links here so that you can join them. The Network's Lived Experience Advisory Group, the League, which is just an incredible group of people, will also be hosting a webinar early in the grant call outlining their experiences of involvement in research and their views on good practice. And there'll be an opportunity for an interactive Q&A session with them and to book a 15-minute slot to talk through your involvement ideas with the group. This is going to be held on the 17th of January from 10:30 to 12. And you can register your attendance also again on Eventbrite. Again, all of these links will be sent out to everyone. So we really are trying to give you every possible opportunity to make the best collaborative project with artists and people with lived experience and researchers. And very finally, we're really excited to announce that we've set up a new lived experience researcher and artist forum specifically for this grant to help people network outside of those events that we have mentioned. This is the new LIRA forum, Lived Experience Researcher Artist Forum. And I've put up a little picture of what that forum looks like here. It's a really exciting space where you can also access the application pack for this grant and link back to the VAM website. It's a fairly simple site. You do have to sign up, but it's not a long and complicated process, and you don't have to sign up with your own names. Here, you'll be able to post details about yourself and your work and connect with and follow other people, post calls on the forum for collaboration around specific projects, engage other people's interests. There's a really easy 3-step guide to using the forum that you'll see available there. On the forum, you simply head over and create an account and create a profile for yourself, sharing only things that you would like to share with people on the forum. We will be monitoring who signs up and trying to keep it a safe space. And as soon as you're signed up, you can start connecting with other people on the forum. You'll see there are some people from our own group who've already joined and started testing out the site and are there to connect with. We've also got some tutorials on how to interact on the site that we've put together, and we will be putting up a video on the VAM website to help people even further if they need help. But the most important thing that you need to know is that if you found someone on the site that you'd like to connect with, but you're not comfortable sharing your details even within this forum, you can get in touch with us at VAM by email, and we'll help you to connect with people that you've met in a more private way. Okay, my slides don't seem to want to move on right now. There we go. We've got my mouse back. Very finally, there's more information about the call available, a full brief and application pack on the VAM website. I've got a link there. Angeli will post that in the chat as well. And this year, we're not submitting paper applications. We're trying to be a little bit more paperless, and we've got a online application form, and the link is here as well. So that's everything about our really exciting arts grant competition. We're looking forward to absolutely fabulous collaborations and really exciting projects. And we hope to see some wonderful projects from all of you submitted. So we're looking forward to that. We're now going to move across to our panel discussion. Today, we have a really exciting panel discussion on an issue that I've been thinking about for quite a long time, which is researcher trauma. It's something that's come up in a lot of the projects that I've been working on, thinking about how researchers are impacted by the work that they do and the ethics and politics involved in that. I'm briefly going to introduce our wonderful panel members. and then I'll hand across to them as we go through the panel. Please do remember to post your questions in the Q&A. So on our panel today, we have Emma Williamson. Emma is a reader in gender-based violence in the Centre for Gender and Violence Research at the University of Bristol. She has over 25 years of experience researching various aspects of gendered abuse. She also has an interest in research ethics and integrity. She is currently the co-editor of the Journal of Gender-Based Violence, which is based at the University of Bristol. And she's going to be speaking to us today about recognizing structural and individual strategies for secondary trauma. Next up on our panel, we have Laura Thurman. Laura Thurman is a PhD researcher at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Manchester. Her PhD project examines gendered security practices and violence in ethnographic fieldwork. Today, she's going to be speaking to us about an applied approach to gendered safety in fieldwork. And next up on our panel, we have Jennifer Holly. Jennifer is a PhD student at King's College London, and she has a long history of working for voluntary sector organizations in the field of domestic and sexual abuse. Her PhD focuses on conceptualizations of maternal instinct and the links with perinatal mental health and how maternal parental self-efficacy can be supported. And finally on our panel, but definitely not least, we have Neymar Iqbal. And Neymar is one of our outstanding members of the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network Lived Experience Advisory Group. She's an expert by experience who has campaigned against domestic and sexual violence. She has worked with a number of organizations, including AVA, Agenda, the McPinn Foundation, and through this initial discussion. Emma, I would like to hand over to you now, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today. As has already been mentioned, I'm based at the University of Bristol in the Centre for Gender and Violence Research. And what I wanted to talk about today is to just reflect on some of the work that we've been doing, but it actually runs through all of the work that I've done over a number of decades now. So in 2020, we published a paper, and I will put the link to that paper in the chat when I've finished. And that was looking at secondary trauma. It was recognizing that as we'd been involved in a very large project with quite a large team, which was helpful, and actually talking about how we managed that secondary trauma, how we managed trying to conduct the research, but also recognizing that it can have an impact on individual research as well. But that comes on the back of, way back in 2004, as a centre, we were the Domestic Violence Research Group at that point, writing even then about ethics and recognising that within an ethical framework, we had to think about the well-being, emotional well-being of researchers as well. And what I would say as well here is that I'm talking about well-being of researchers, but I'm very conscious that when we're doing research, if we're talking to people with lived experiences, we too may have those lived experiences. So I'm not differentiating and saying you've got a them and us. I think many of us come to work in this field and are motivated to work in this field because we have lived experiences as well. So there are blurred boundaries there, but that also then is something that needs to be managed and thought about, and it isn't always. So we were quite conscious way back in sort of 2004 that when we're thinking about ethics, what's safe in research, we're thinking about what's safe for participants, but also how that can be safe for researchers as well. And going even further back, when I was doing my own PhD in 1995, I was working with an NGO, and quite early on it became apparent that because I was kind of on my own as a PhD student in a university where there wasn't a group as such, that the NGO were kind of trying to support me emotionally, but that actually wasn't their job. So we did put together then a memorandum of understanding, which was very clear that actually it was the university as my employer or my supervisor who had responsibility to ensure that I was safe, and it wasn't the responsibility of the NGOs that we were working with. So I think this idea of how we maintain that safety is really important to me. And that's why I've continued to work in ethics and thought about research integrity, etc. I also think when we're talking about, certainly in an academic context, very often this idea of well-being becomes a very individualized issue. It becomes, well, why don't you go and do that online CBT, or why don't you go and do some yoga, or why don't you do some mindfulness, all of which is great. And I'll say a little bit about that. But also there are some structural issues that we need to recognize. And sometimes as researchers, we are discouraged from reflecting on how research might be impacting on us because of the structures around us. So if you're an early careers researcher, if you're on a short-term contract, you may not want to flag up to your line manager that you're struggling with a particular interview or a piece of work or a literature review or whatever that is, because you feel that that might undermine your academic career. And I think we need to change that culture. I think we need to recognize, and this kind of event is really important. I've spoken at a number of events like this to actually start to say we all struggle with these issues. And it is about trying to find ways in which we can connect with each other and find healthy, useful strategies to be able to continue the work that we do, because we have the motivation to do that. What I would also say is we've been pushing very much for the idea of clinical supervision or specialist mentoring, primarily because I think sometimes because of the structural issues that impact on within the academic context, for example, or even within an NGO, then your line manager might not be the best person to talk to if you're struggling emotionally with the impacts of the trauma that you're researching or doing work with. And so it's really important to be able to have an independent person who you have those conversations with. At the moment, most of that comes down to, in terms of provision, will be if you have an issue, you'll be told to go to seek help from the counselling service, for example, whether you're staff or student. But that's very reactive. And what we believe is really important is to have a proactive approach to that, whereby you can meet with an independent clinical supervisor to talk about what the issues might be, recognizing that you might have lived experience, but also what the triggers might be for you as a researcher working in this field, and what your coping strategies might be, and what you also need structurally from the institution that you're working within. So we think that's really important. We have been pushing for that. Some successes. So we did get some success with the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership for 2 PhD students to actually have funded clinical supervision, but that wasn't something that was given. We had to push quite hard for that, because there was an idea that that's the job of a supervisor, or that's the job of counselling services in the university. And what we're very clear about is that this is something different. This is actually an additional resource that's needed. And my own view is that if you get a funding bid that deals with trauma, and it could be gender-based violence, you could be doing research on cancer, suicide, mental health issues, all of those things, then it's really important that the fund recognises that if it's about trauma, there should be a very small percentage ring-fenced that's added on top of that grant to enable people to have clinical supervision. So I can just see something in the chat about clinical supervision. Counsellors do have clinical supervision. I pay for my own clinical supervision because it's not available, and I can afford to do that, but most people can't. And I think that's a real problem. I think we need it as a matter of course. I think we need to be pushing for that. And it is about being more proactive. It's about recognising what we can and can't change, about trying to find healthy ways to deal with that. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to put the link to the paper in the chat, and I'm very happy if anyone needs to contact or wants to contact me for more information, I can send that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's all really insightful, and also echoing a lot of the experiences that I personally have had, and discussions that I've had, particularly with early career researchers who are working in this field. So I'd like to hand over now to Laura, who also wants to say a few words. Thanks, Laura.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to share a short presentation, if it's possible. So hope you can see this now.
It's all good.
So my name is Laura Thurman. I'm a PhD student in anthropology at the University of Manchester. Thank you so much for inviting me to this network meeting. I'm really happy to be here today. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk a bit about my current project on gendered violence in fieldwork, which due to the pandemic is mainly taking place online via Zoom interviews and online events. Before I start, I would like to quickly point out that while I am conducting research about researchers and academic events like this one, I am not collecting any data on this event today. In social sciences, violence can be considered an established research topic, but researchers' experiences of violence are a relatively new field, especially when it relates to the gender dimensions of fieldwork violence. In the last decade, an increasing number of scholars started publishing about their own experiences of gendered violence and trauma during fieldwork, and researchers founded new groups and initiatives that started raising awareness for the gendered risks that might occur in fieldwork. Furthermore, in 2019, Hansen and Richards published the book Harassed, based on a study about sexual harassment experienced by US-based social scientists. I think that such academic work can really show the complexity and diversity of violent encounters and how they can impact researchers and research on different levels. What I found is still missing, however, is a systematic analysis of the structures that contribute to gendered risk and safety during fieldwork. So a study that takes into account all actors, practices, and networks that researchers can or cannot access before, during, and after fieldwork. So when asking what provides safety at fieldwork, I find it important not only to look at safety as prevention of violence, but also in terms of emotional safety as prevention or mitigation of further effects that violence or dealing with violence can have on researchers. I think that in order to prevent or mitigate experiences and effects of gendered violence and to create new support structures, it is necessary to first understand the phenomenon in all its complexity. So in my current research, I am studying such practices of prevention, mitigation, and support on 3 different levels. Firstly, the institutional level, on which I ask what universities do and do not do in order to prevent gendered violence or support researchers who face unsafe conditions in the field. Secondly, I'm looking at the initiative level, on which I have a look at the groups that I already mentioned, to the initiatives that exist outside of university contexts, which provide trainings and support. I examine their motivations, publications, and the events they organize, and also the hurdles they face in their everyday work and academic environment. So the third level is the individual level, on which I explore individual researchers' experiences and security practices in the field and how this is linked to our methodology, common tropes, and ideas about what constitutes being a good researcher. I am conducting this research in terms of applied anthropology. That means that next to collecting data and writing my thesis, obviously, I am also aiming to implement some of my results into academic practice. I'm currently involved in an initiative with my 2 dear colleagues, Tamara Guppa and Kira Kraft from the University of Frankfurt. And together we developed and are further developing a concept for a workshop which addresses researcher safety in a holistic way. We want to step away from teaching universally applicable safety strategies. Firstly, because the idea that there are prevention strategies that work in every research project and situation can increase prevalent issues like victim blaming or feelings of guilt after a violent experience. And secondly, because many risks are too complex and they are also often tied to individual situations, positionalities, and research contexts. So in our workshop, we are providing a platform for researchers and research students to discuss and reflect upon different risks, safety strategies, support structures, and resources. Also with regards to questions of researchers' individual topics, positionalities, and intersectional vulnerabilities during fieldwork. With this applied approach to understanding researchers' gendered safety, I am ultimately trying to make a very small contribution, at least, to future researchers' safety and fieldwork. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to get in touch if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, Laura. Your research is really incredible and so needed. So thank you so much for sharing with us. That's great. I'm going to hand over now to Jennifer. Jennifer, if you want to come on and you've got something to say, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Holly. I worked in the field of domestic and sexual abuse for many, many years, doing research and organisational development, supporting organisations to become more informed about domestic and sexual abuse, but also about trauma. Over the years, the language has shifted from being able to respond more effectively to domestic and sexual abuse to becoming more trauma informed and incorporating many different forms of trauma within that. I worked at AVA, which is Against Violence and Abuse, for a number of years, and during COVID, we ran a number of webinars and seminars and developed a resource pack or website where shared information about how professionals, practitioners, researchers could look after themselves, particularly during COVID, but everything that we shared is relevant whether, if COVID ever ends or not. So I wanted to share a few bits of those resources, very practical information, I think really to reflect though, or to repeat what Emma said, that working in close contact with trauma, whether you're reading about trauma that people have experienced, whether you're interviewing people who've experienced trauma, it's a very individual experience for you as the researcher. How it impacts on you will depend on the context you're in, your own life experience, and what you need to be able to safely work with that. Also is very individual. So I'm going to share some practical ideas, but it's for you to take away. What's useful for you, great. Other bits, just leave it. So a recap that reading, hearing about other people's experiences can be upsetting, understandably. It can be distressing, but it also can lead to a more profound impact on us, particularly if we're working with trauma, closely with trauma on a repeated basis. It's a large part of our work. But also, I think it can be combined with burnout, with compassion fatigue, particularly when we think about the organisations and the structures that we're working within, that can be under-resourced, that can be over-demanding. So we have to be mindful of all of those different aspects that we could be working with. What secondary trauma looks like? It looks like many different things, and I would encourage you, you're going to see these slides later, have a look. Does any of this sound familiar to you at this point in time? There's links in the slides to other resources that you might find useful. On this slide, there's a link to the ProQual, which is Professional Quality of Life measure that you can use to measure whether you meet the sort of the threshold for secondary trauma or burnout or compassion fatigue. Thinking about what might help you, I like the idea of everyone having a toolkit to help them work with trauma. And it works on 3 different levels, like the previous speaker, at 3 different levels. So I think about it as things that can help you in the moment when you're in close contact with someone who may have experienced trauma, or their very intense responses to what has happened to them in your day. So thinking about how you go about your day that will help you work with trauma. And then in your life more generally, how do you build resilience to be able to continue doing all of this work? And I've got a point to come back to afterwards, that this is not just about you as an individual. Your employer also has a responsibility to make the conditions available so that you can look after yourself. as well as you taking some of that responsibility. So very briefly, and there's lots of links on this slide when you get it to extra resources. But just in that moment when you're working with that trauma, prepare. Do you know what triggers you? Do you know what you might find particularly upsetting? Can you find a way of coping with that distress particularly if you're interviewing someone or doing focus group? Is there a breathing technique that works for you? Do you have grounding techniques? Can you do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, looking around the room, engaging your senses? Is it possible to take a break if you're really find yourself distressed at a certain point? When you're thinking about your day, not just those moments, again, I'm going to say, take breaks. And this is where an employer is really important. Do they give you enough time in your day to take those breaks? Are your work levels so high that you don't feel able to take a break? Mix up your day. Make sure there's a mix of things that you're going to be doing your day, not just going from reading about trauma to interviewing someone about trauma to lecturing about trauma and back to reading. Having a mix and making sure you're looking after yourselves is really important. Connecting with your colleagues, particularly important again when we're often working remotely or more remotely still than we were. Can you just pop on Zoom without planning that appointment and contact a colleague and say, I really need a coffee break, a tea break. Can you sit with me for 10 minutes? Let's have a chat. Do you focus on your to-do lists? Always thinking about what you've still got to do? Or can you incorporate, this sounds stupid, I know it does, and it involves a sing-song voice and jazz hands, but do you have a ta-da list where you focus on at the end of your day about all the things you have achieved rather than all the things you've still got to do, to balance out some of the negativity that we can become absorbed in and that hopelessness and that powerlessness that we might feel from having close contact with trauma? Do you have rituals that help you end your day? Do you wash your hands, pack your bag, even if you're working from home? Can you do a visualization? My visualization, I sit on the bank of a river. And as I say the words, this is not my story. I see them going down the river, along the water and away, so that I'm not holding on to what other people have told me. Visualization can be difficult, not for everyone, but certainly work for me and might be something you want to think about. And then finally, in life more generally, what's coming next? I can't even see what that says at the top there. Boundaries. There's a brilliant video by Brene Brown about boundaries. I've put the link in the slides. Please do take the 5 minutes after this and watch that. We need to be able to put in boundaries within work, within our life, on the trauma that we might be working with. Em's already mentioned it. Ask for, demand clinical supervision and make use of it. It's so important that we're asking for this and making the need for it known. Take care of your body. It sounds silly. Nourish your body, cherish your body. Listen to your body when it's telling you you need to take a break. Please do that and move your body in between pieces of work, in between work day. Move, even just doing your shoulders. I'd love you to just, we've been sitting here for what, that 40 minutes now. Just move. It helps shift your mind as well between activities. And practice self-compassion is a wonderful area of work led by Kristin Neff, that again, a link in the slides. Be kind to yourself, particularly when things don't go as planned, rather than taking all that blame on yourself, which again, we can have a tendency to do when we're feeling powerless or helpless because we're working a lot with trauma. And finally, a fabulous activity called Taking in the Good. And this will be my last point because I know I've overrun, sorry. But taking in the good comes from the understanding that as humans, we're hardwired to remember negative experiences or stories or anything we had, and it's a protection mechanism. We have to actively work much harder to draw on positive experiences, to bring them up in our memory. When taking in the good is doing some of that active retrieval of memory. So go with me if you want to, but just close your eyes if you want to, or just stare at me doing this myself. And just take yourself back to a moment in the last few days, something positive, either something made you laugh, made you feel warm and fuzzy inside, something happened that you were proud of. Conjure up that image in your mind of that moment. And just breathe in that experience, in finding yourself. Where can you feel that in your body? What can you see around you when that happened? Imagine as you breathe in that it's seeping through your body, your arms, your legs, into your fingers. And just focus on that really wonderful, positive experience for 10 or 15 seconds. And just by doing that for those few extra seconds, we can start building up a number of positive memories or experiences that we can draw on, rather than immediately going to the negative, which we can find ourselves doing when we're working with trauma a lot. So come back, open your eyes if you haven't already. So yeah, just a lot of resources there. You can go back to these slides afterwards. I put a quote here by Judith Thurman, who is a leader in this field. She talks about the solidarity of a group providing the strongest protection against terror and despair, and the strongest antidote to the traumatic experience. And this goes back to the idea of connecting, finding your tribe, as it were, to work with together in this field, whether it's in your organisation, externally, through Twitter, however you do it, so you're not working on this alone, but also that we're talking to our employers to make sure they're doing their part. That means you can take care of yourself. And finally, please take a moment after the session is finished to be kind to yourself. And yeah, I'm going to move on because I've run over and I'm very sorry for that. But thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think that's some really practical information for us to take away in thinking about building resilience and thinking about how to go about our own work when we are working on violence, abuse, trauma, mental health. So that's really wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Neymar, I'm going to hand over to you if you would like to say a few words before we open up to the questions. Neymar, you're on mute.
Hi all, sorry.
Super.
I didn't even realize. Okay, I'm going to start with, hang on a second, I'm just going to start timer. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm going to talk about a few personal things now, and I'm asking you to take a break if this triggers anyone. It's not my intention at all. I'm just going to talk about what it's been like as a lived experience researcher from the beginning. My personal experience as a volunteer. I volunteered with AVA, and I worked with them a couple of years as a volunteer, and then they got me into paid work. But my experiences, obviously, it was really daunting coming from my background and stuff, and not having that self-belief and self-worth. And I had a few meltdowns along the way, but they were really, really supportive, even to the point of waiting for me at a train station, completely different train station to where everyone else was meeting up, because I found it just easier to catch the train from where I live, from another place, which was, you know, I wasn't expecting that. I've never had that with a professional workplace before, so that was really good. It was a massive growth experience for me. My confidence grew. I networked with lots of different people. I met lots of amazing women. I didn't feel alone. And I had the opportunity to do lots of amazing things, speak at the House of Lords. I was on the radio, all sorts of really, really amazing, like exhilarating kind of, oh, I can't believe I'm doing this. And then I went into therapy, and again, I learned lots of skills. I had EMDR, all of that. So I was really getting to, I was really getting better, and then during lockdown, my mental health declined due to waiting for an operation procedure type of thing that I needed. It was to do with my past abuse and trauma. So it was, it was probably a lot worse in my head than it was actually, in real life, but that's how it is with trauma, isn't it? And then I worked online at that time, and again, trauma-informed environment, and it was completely different. It was different, but it was still really healthy because lots of things were put in place. I want to share with you some of the things that they have in place with AVA when you're working for them as a volunteer or paid. We had a journal at the end of the interview packs for you to unpack what you were going through. That really helped. What things stood out for you in the interview, what you're taking away from it. It just helps you to offload. It's like a clinical supervision thing. And then, so then recently I started a new job and everything was going really amazing. I was coming across like a high functioning individual, independent and stuff, really going places, working, meeting lots of different people. I support lots of different, I work with, as a volunteer with other charities as well. And I meet lots of women, and I'm supporting a number of women right now. And then an incident took place. I'm going to share something really personal now. An incident took place in my own private life, completely knocked me out of the water. I didn't even realize it, but I was actually relapsing. I was called in by management when I got my new job. I hadn't got any training, and I was going into a professional environment for the first time. And as you know, it's really daunting, and you've got that kind of self-doubt, etc. And I felt that I couldn't disclose. I didn't feel like safe to disclose. I'm going to go over slightly, I think. I felt like I couldn't disclose anything personal that was going on, but I kind of hinted that I had a very stressful meeting that I had to attend with a perpetrator to try and get myself into a safe space. And that's all I said to them. And I also said I was going through a lot of stress at the time, but I didn't actually disclose the abuse. And what happened is it spiraled out of control. And I didn't even realize, but I was very cynical and negative when people were speaking to me. And obviously you can't do that in a professional environment. And obviously it was called up. The problem is it was called up half an hour before I had to meet with the perpetrator. I had a full meltdown. Now with my PTSD, I have chronic pain management that I have to do like all the time, and lots of different triggers that I manage. And I was coping so amazing before. This all gone out the window, and I don't know how I got here. It's been really difficult for me. And just to get back up and just to start saying no to people and actually doing the self-care and learning all the techniques all over again. I've gone from here to there, and I don't know how I've done it. I don't know how I got there. It can happen to anyone, and I just wish that more places were trauma informed. And my management where I'm working now, they were really good after I disclosed and stuff, but it's that kind of embarrassment and that kind of feeling of not being good enough and feeling of failure and self-doubt that really affects you. I just wanted to share that with you. Yeah, so it can happen even outside of work as well. So yeah. I'll pass you back over now.
Thank you so much, Neymar. Thank you for sharing such personal details with us. Thank you for sharing from your own experience. It's very difficult to do, and we really appreciate that because it's so valuable for us to hear, and you articulate yourself so clearly. The issues come across so well for us to understand. And I think what's really stood out to me was as really insightful is just all the different institutions that are not trauma informed when we interact with them, from workplaces to medical institutions, and how difficult that really is. So thank you so much, Neymar. I think if we can have all the panelists back on to answer any questions or add to each other if they've got questions for each other or anything that they'd like to share back, that would be great. I think no one has posted anything in the Q&A box, so please do post in the Q&A box if you've got questions for our panelists. But across the chat, I've seen people are having a lot of conversations, and it's really great. People are sharing resources. I think one thing that's come up is a lot of discussion around how we need to be including things around researcher trauma and researcher safety into our funding applications, how funders are thinking about these issues, but also into our research ethics applications, where although some people are saying, because they're informed about it, they tend to ask these questions. My experience with research ethics committees is quite different. I think that's not the norm. I think it isn't usually considered. And there's a lot of nitpicking about many other things in research ethics committees, but this is not something that's picked up on. And it really should be, especially when PIs haven't thought about it and they're bringing in early career researchers to do work on the ground. So that was one thing that I picked up from the chat. I'm not sure if anyone else on the panel wants to pick up on that point a little bit more. How do we move? I suppose the question is, how do we start to shift the culture in research ethics? Yeah, Emma.
So I'm our faculty research ethics officer, and I've been involved in research ethics for a long time. And I think for us, that was exactly the point. We were being asked we were being asked questions that were actually irrelevant to what we were doing. And then the big safety risk issues were not being picked up because we knew what those risks were more than the people who were looking at it, which is partly why we got involved, because we actually then were able to say, no, well, you're not asking us this, and this is really dangerous. For example, going into a house, if you're interviewing someone and they've got a dog, I've been in a situation where the woman's got upset and the dog reacts because the dog sees the woman getting upset like she used to and starts growling at me as the researcher because I'm upsetting the woman. Now, if you've not been in that situation or you haven't done research in that environment, you wouldn't know that. So I think it's really important that we as a collective, as a group, are involved in the processes to ask those questions about researcher safety. But also I think the point Neymar was making, and thank you for sharing your experiences, surviving is a long-term process with ups and downs. It's long-term. So, and very often when you speak to people who in research who perhaps experienced abuse quite a long time ago, but that research process can be traumatic. And those people might not access support because they see, oh, well, that's for people in crisis when it's just happened. But we have a real problem about what we do long term because it isn't something that goes away. It's something we try to learn to live with, but it is really, that's hard. As Neymar's just pointed out, it's really difficult to do that. And I think we don't do that enough. There's this side. And I don't want to be in a situation where we get people going, well, if you've had experiences, you shouldn't be doing that job. I'm absolutely not saying that. We have to be very careful how we do it. But people should be supported to be able to do the work that we do, and it should be recognised. People who do work on genocide, historical work, suicide, mental health, all of those issues have trauma and they need to be able to address it. And ethics is one way, but occupational health, human resources, there's a whole range of other departments in universities who need to be picking that up.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think pointing out the holistic and systemic approach there is really, really critical. Jennifer, I'm going to hand over to you for a quick reply there, and then I'm just going to ask some questions from the chat. So go ahead, Jennifer.
I think just pulling up again repeating what Emma said, really, and that this is holistic. It's not about clinical supervision. Too often if we offer clinical supervision, we tick the box to be trauma informed as an organisation, and actually it has to go through all management. It has to go through every aspect of how the organisation functions. We can't rely on 2 hours of clinical supervision a month to do that job. It has to be throughout every day and every week that we're working with trauma.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So I've got 2 questions in the chat. I've got one question from Alexis. Hi, Alexis. And she's asking, how have any of you members of the panel perhaps navigated issues when the mistreatment or denial of support for a researcher who's working in this field is coming from within your own team, which I think is something that's quite possibly difficult to manage. Anyone got any thoughts for Alexis? Yeah, Emma, sure.
I mean, I'm really lucky in that I'm in a big team. So you find the people who you're comfortable to talk to. You might not, we don't all get on with each other. There may be people who you don't gel with, but if you're in a team, you can do that. The problem occurs if it's a small team, or if you're doing a PhD and you're doing it on your own, and you're limited to your supervisors, for example, and you haven't got the other support network, which is why I think networks like this are so important. It is about, and it's difficult to put yourself out there in that way, but it is about finding people you can have that with. So in our team, if somebody's having a bad day and they've done an interview and they need to take themselves off to deal with that, somebody else will step in because they know that tomorrow that might be them. And that is how it has to work, really, that we have to support each other to do it. Yeah, I'm recognizing that. It is a really difficult one, but then again, that's partly why if you can talk that through with an external independent person, that might give you the tools to raise it in the team. Whereas you may not feel comfortable raising it in the team.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think there's a delicate balancing act between saying to someone they need to be the ones to raise things, or they need to go out and find external support or bring new ideas to the table, which is obviously adding a lot of burden to them, and and thinking about what we can do when we're not in a very supportive environment to try and change that environment. So there's a delicate balance between those two things.
So on a large project, we had it on our agenda for every meeting. We would check in, but then not everybody wants to say that in that environment. But we were able to develop a team around that and talk about it, have sessions on that, why it was important. If people didn't want to and they wanted to go to individuals, they could, or they could go externally, and trying to find as many ways as possible so that people are comfortable to discuss it. Because if you don't know somebody's struggling, then you can't do anything about it. So there is that. But yeah, giving as many opportunities as you can to raise it and making that normalized, that it's okay to ask the question and have that on the agenda alongside everything else, but actually and at the top of the agenda so it doesn't get knocked off when.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I've got one more question from Angela that we've got 2 minutes to answer. Hi, Angela. So we've got a question here that says, this is a really fascinating and important session, so thank you to all of the speakers. She wants to know, what do speakers think might be the relationship between researcher safety and support on the one hand and participant safety and support on the other? Does anyone from the panel have any thoughts how those two things balance up? I think Emma started off her discussion talking about the blurred lines between these two positions and the different hats that people wear at different times. But Jennifer's unmuted herself, so I think she's got something to say.
And just that some of us have that lived experience and we are researchers, and sometimes we are participants as well. We may put ourselves forward to be participants. And if we can create a space that is safe for our participants and provide them with the right support, then we should be able to do the same for our researchers. That should not be, a safe environment is safe for everyone, and the right support is the right support for everyone. So it all has to come together.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I think that's exactly right. I think these two things are interrelated, and we can't do away with one without doing away with the other. And what we do for researchers and their safety enhances the safety that we've built for our participants as well, and vice versa. So they're quite intimately related, I would say. Okay, so we've come to 11 o'clock, and I think everyone would agree with me that we've just had unbelievably fantastic insights from all of our speakers today. So thank you so much, panelists, for joining us. This has been incredible. Everyone will be able to view this panel in the recordings on our website. And we're going to take a 10-minute comfort break now. And please do come back and join us for an amazing keynote speech that we're going to have, which I'm very excited about. So see you all in 10 minutes. And thank you again, panelists. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. It's 10:10, so we're going to come back. I hope that you all had a really good comfort break and you're able to get something to drink or head off to the bathroom or whatever it is you needed to do, stretch your legs or just step away from your screen. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speakers for today, Abby Shepherd-Fields, who is a psychologist based in Nicaragua. Her main area of specialization for the past 25 years has been trauma and sexual violence. Her current research examines mind-body relationship in processes of trauma, of post-trauma recovery, and more specifically, the practices of trauma-informed yoga with adult female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And joining her on this wonderful keynote speech is also Elizabeth Dartnell, who is the Executive Director of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, which has over 7,000 members and is one of the largest global networks in the field of research on violence against women and violence against children. She's a health specialist with over 20 years of research in policy making and health systems, mental health, violence against women, and violence against children. And also joining her is Sophie Nami, who is the founder and co-director of Healing and Resilience After Trauma, HEART, an organization dedicated to a future where women and girls can access spaces for collective trauma healing through integrated mind-body practices. She's also a technical advisor at Raising Voices and a member of COFEM's Coordination Committee. She has over 14 years of experience in feminist research and practice to prevent violence against women. Today, our keynote speakers will be talking to us about healing from sexual violence, body-focused mental health approaches, and this is something that I'm really excited about. I have a short section in one of my courses where we talk about interventions to improve the mental health of survivors of violence, and my students are always really interested in mind-body focused approaches or body-focused approaches to improve mental health, and it's something that I think is really gaining a lot of traction and people are very interested in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our keynote speakers, and I'm also going to share my screen with some of their slides for them, and they're just going to let me know when they'd like me to change over. So handing over to you, Abby, Liz, and Sophie.
Charlie, I'm not unable to start my video. This is Abby.
Oh, okay. But I think everyone can see the slides.
Okay.
And I'm sharing them now. So if you're having difficulty with your video, that's probably okay.
I think I can do it now. Hi.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Abby.
So good morning. It's very early in Nicaragua. I'm very happy to be here nonetheless. It's always wonderful to be sharing time with people who are working in the field of sexual violence and supporting the recovery of survivors. My name, as you know, is Abby, and I've been living and working in Nicaragua for over 35 years. My recent doctoral research focused on the mind-body relationship in healing from sexual abuse, and I worked with young Nicaraguan women who are all survivors of child sex abuse. I'd like to begin today by reading you something one of these women told me in an interview following an 18-week trauma-informed yoga program. Her name here is Juanita. Next slide, please. I was looking for the key and I think I found it. I no longer feel the same weight or the same emotion, the same guilt. I feel completely calm, relaxed, safe. There's something that happened and now I can see it. Yes, I think the yoga has had a lot to do with my healing process, because if not, it wouldn't have been possible for me to connect with myself or understand others, because I feel like everything was shut down. Everything was deafened because you're so stuck in the pain. Next slide, please. This talk examines why so many survivors of sexual violence continue to struggle through their lifetimes, not only with psychological problems, but also in their intimate relationships, in their ability to regulate emotions, in their connection with their own bodies, and with a range of physical problems. We will touch on some new research theories that explain the unique way traumatic memories are processed in the brain, circumventing the frontal cortex and recorded instead in the limbic area. As a result, such memories often cannot be accessed through cognitive talk-based therapy, which has important implications for treatment. These same theories also underpin much of our understanding of the relationship between the body and mind in healing processes. Finally, we will consider some positive outcomes of body-focused programs, which point to the need to adopt more holistic approaches to trauma recovery research and interventions. Next slide, please. The PTSD diagnosis has been something of a double-edged sword within the predominant paradigm of psychology. A one-size-fits-all conceptualization of the impact of all traumatic experience across all cultures, it highlights a cluster of symptoms: intrusive thoughts, avoidance, emotional numbing, and hyperarousal, which, although typically present at some point for most sexual violence survivors, does not capture other life domains that can be impacted. In the early 1990s, psychologist Judith Thurman and others formulated some alternative conceptualizations to PTSD. Complex trauma identified a range of impacts that seem to better typify the more complex psychological condition of survivors of sexual violence. Affect dysregulation leaves survivors emotionally shut down and unable to control sensations of rage, fear, anxiety, sadness, and frequently self-directed anger. This emotional instability is often associated with a severe mistrust of others, greatly impeding the ability to form intimate relationships and fueling an overwhelming sense of hopelessness about their lives. Finally, survivors often suffer from problems with concentration and memory and various ongoing physical problems that seriously interfere with basic functioning in life. Perhaps the most severe symptom associated with childhood abuse is the feeling of disconnection from one's own body, which gives rise to many of the conditions mentioned above. Adolescent and adult survivors can experience a sense of estrangement from their bodies, at times leading to self-harm, suicidal ideation, and suicide attempts. But they frequently do not associate these sensations with their abuse, unaware of the origin of their self-hate. Next slide, please. In recent decades, psychiatrists, neuropsychologists, and other researchers have proposed that under certain trauma-inducing conditions, especially when escape or self-defense is impossible, experiences are processed differently due to the specific neurological circuitry that's activated. Human instinct automatically triggers neurological and hormonal processes when survival is threatened, which in turn affect the way that memories are stored in the brain. Next slide. Normally, the most developed part of the human brain, the prefrontal cortex, takes in information and creates a narrative that's then incorporated into our memory. When trauma occurs, however, the thalamus, located in that executive part of the brain, completely shuts down. So although an imprint of the experience is left behind in the brain, it lacks a corresponding story. Sometimes there is explicit memory of the event, sometimes there isn't. For instance, it's not unusual for a woman who's just been raped to be unable to recount the story of what has happened, though she can remember the smell of the rapist. Because of the state of activation during trauma, the experience is recorded in a more primitive part of the brain, the limbic area, whose functions include perceptions and emotions. Unlike memories processed in the frontal cortex, feelings associated with traumatic experiences are stored as a series of separate sensations rather than part of a coherent and accessible story. The lack of cognitive access to such non-narrative memories can limit the ability to heal. Next slide. Being traumatized, whether due to exposure to war, torture, or sexual violence, means that people can find themselves out of sync with their own bodies and what is going on around them. Trauma can get locked in the body, leaving many victims feeling immobilized and helpless, or in a continuous state of alert, never able to calm. A person who's been sexually abused as a child, for instance, can understand what has happened and how it's affected them, but they still keep reacting. To control the response, the body memory also needs to be attenuated. And this is not a cognitive process, it's somatic. Next slide. Despite its documented usefulness in many therapeutic settings, the effectiveness of cognitive-based therapies, particularly talk therapy, in treating the long-lasting symptoms associated with trauma is not clear. In contrast, a range of techniques focused on both the body and the mind have sought new ways of accessing traumatic memories without provoking the painful re-experiencing often triggered when verbally recounting traumatic events. These techniques include EMDR, somatic experiencing, neurofeedback, meditation, yoga, and others. Numerous body-focused approaches that have emerged in recent years have been incorporated into therapeutic healing interventions and have shown significant results in reducing trauma-related symptomology. Some of the more contemplative ones, principally yoga and meditation, are based to some degree on secular interpretations of Buddhist and Hindu philosophy and the attainment of a higher level of mindfulness, which refers to a mental state attained through focusing on the present moment while simultaneously learning to recognize and accept feelings, thoughts, and body sensations, whether these are agreeable or not. Next slide, please. When yoga is part of a trauma healing process, the goal is learning to tolerate bodily feelings and sensations, achieving a greater connection with oneself, more awareness of what is happening on the inside, and learning to modulate activation or the triggering of automatic responses to reminders of a previous trauma. Yoga helps people to deal with body responses that are often set off by sensory stimuli, images, smells, or other sensations through learning to recognize emotions rather than avoid them. It engenders a greater sense of security or safety in the moment and helps integrate these emotional memories as positive sensations in the present. Next slide. In a study about the mind-body relationship in healing from trauma conducted in Nicaragua in 2017, adult female survivors of child sex abuse who took part in a trauma-informed yoga program underwent dramatic, life-altering changes that included notable reductions in physical, psychological, and emotional symptoms, and positive growth in the form of greater tolerance of sensations, reconnection with their bodies, increased self-acceptance and self-awareness, and improved intimate relationships. The outcome of the yoga practice that seemed to resonate most strongly with the women was their sense of reconnection with their bodies. The alienation they had experienced from their bodies as adolescents and young women had given rise to numerous physical and psychological symptoms. Connecting again, being able to accept and love their bodies was a central component of healing and positive growth. At the simplest level, this meant a new sense of control over their bodies, such as the ability to do new and sometimes challenging things. Eventually, this connection led to a greater sense of control over emotions and feelings. As they all stated in one form or another, the body was the key. Feeling, accepting, and loving their bodies opened the door to so much self-discovery, enabling them to feel parts of themselves that had been shut down for so long. Next slide. Ana, a young Nicaraguan woman who for many years had lost all memory of her childhood abuse, told me afterwards, "Like I said, I now have memories, but I no longer try to avoid them all the time. And I definitely think it's been positive, giving me the ability to see that my body speaks. Yoga has allowed me this opening to listen and explore the abuse that was hidden away, and to be able to heal. Next slide. Not all human beings respond in the same way to traumatic events, and not everyone exposed to sexual violence requires psychological attention. Similarly, not all survivors of trauma respond by working through their experiences as suggested by the Western model of psychotherapy. A growing body of evidence points to the importance of engaging the body in trauma healing. As so clearly stated by Brown and Courtois in a recent APA article, clinicians need to attend to what our clients are telling us about what does and does not work for them. We need to follow the innovators. We must take culture, context, and our clients' intersectional identities into account in understanding the meaning of their trauma, their idioms of distress, rather than attempt to squeeze people, particularly those from marginalized groups, into a one-size-fits-all paradigm. I'm going to now turn things over to my two colleagues from SVRI. Sorry, next slide. Who will tell you very briefly about some of their very innovative work in this field. Please feel free to ask questions about their work during the Q&A. Sophie Nami is the founder and co-director of Healing and Resilience After Trauma, an organization dedicated to a future where women and girls can access spaces for collective trauma healing through integrated mind-body practices. Liz Dartnell is the executive director of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, one of the largest global networks in the field of research on violence against women and violence against children. Next slide for Sophie, please. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Abby, and thanks for inviting us and for all these really rich sharings and presentations. I think one thing, just like taking a quick step back, that really is standing out is really how much trauma is part of the fabric of the human experience. You know, it's really something that we all pass through in some way, whether we're creating programming, whether we're researchers, whether we're service providers, whether we're humans, just going through navigating life. And at the same time, we all share this real capacity, this innate capacity to be resilient and to come back to balance after experiencing trauma. And as we've been hearing from some of the different speakers today, one of the key pillars within that is connections. It's human connection and support. And so I'm just going to take a few minutes to share a little bit about one mind-body approach we're using. It's HEART, so you've already heard, Healing and Resilience After Trauma. And we really created this program to provide a feminist space where women and girls who have experienced human trafficking can start to connect with their inner resilience and also build community with one another in a way that helps move through or helps support the process of healing. And we've been working primarily in Uganda since 2015. And at this point, I think we have over 100 women and girls who have gone through the program. And we are adapting for the Philippines currently. So that's really, it's very similar to what Abby has already shared. So we're very much informed by some of the more recent neurological and biological research that's happening around trauma, and that's demonstrating how trauma leaves its imprint on the body, particularly for survivors of violence, and that yoga can be one of those entry points to healing. And the way that HEART works, it's yoga is one of the kind of primary modalities that we use, but we also have several other components of the program. So it's group-based, it's 12 weeks, and each session has its own theme and integrates different mind-body practices. So we have mindfulness exercises, guided visualizations, brief discussions, yoga poses, and other somatic techniques kind of bundled together to explore a specific theme for each practice. And we start in the first month to encourage safety in the body. And so all the sessions in month 1 are really focused around attuning to physical sensations and gaining more comfort and practice focusing on the breath. And then in month 2, we delve into an area that we are calling radical self-love. And here we have sessions oriented around releasing blame, holding space for difficult emotions, and experiencing joy and pleasure. And then in the final month, we kind of are looking at compassion and action. And here we're focused on cultivating and recognizing our shared humanity and sense of, and hopefully providing a sense of belonging. And since the beginning, we've embedded learning and research in the work. So I just wanted to close by sharing just a few of the comments and reflections that we've had from participants, which I think really echo and support what Abby has already shared, perhaps showing a very different context from Nicaragua, in Uganda, the resonance of a similar integrated mind-body approach to healing. So one of our participants said, to me, I think yoga is therapy. It takes your body through an adventure and discovery. And in the long run, you find that it may lead to healing of the heart, body, and soul. And then we had another participant describe the program this way. She said, today's heart yoga session made me feel happy. I realized we were doing a poem. We were expressing our feelings without talking. The way we moved our bodies showed we are in control of our bodies. So here again, seeing a very different experience to the kind of relationships that many trauma survivors have with their bodies, where your body can become quite alienating, can feel like something you don't really want to inhabit and spend a lot of time in, and we start to see how the yoga practice can begin shifting that. And then the last one I would like to share is this is actually a younger girl. She said, if I'm feeling bad physically, I practice yoga and I get better. It also heals emotionally. Like when you use the Shavasana, is the final resting pose. So she says, when you use the Shavasana pose, first of all, you breathe in and then you relax. You close your eyes, and as you relax, you can even start thinking about the positive things in your life. So you start to feel better. I look forward to the discussion, the Q&A, and I'm going to hand over now to Liz to share a bit about the SVRI and all the great leadership that the SVRI is showing in this area of work. And I think we can go to the next slide as well.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you so much, Abby, for these really brilliant presentations. I'd also like to thank the Violence, Abuse and Mental Health Network for inviting us to be part of this meeting today, and how important it is to discuss how trauma impacts our health and well-being, and the importance of exploring different approaches to addressing trauma. So thank you very much for that. Just a little bit about the SVRI. As we know, violence against women is a global problem deeply rooted in gender inequality. But despite the prevalence and the size of this problem, we have very little funding dedicated to addressing this, as I'm sure you all know. Given the extremely limited resources, it is essential that investment is made wisely in solutions that we understand well and how to implement them effectively. And this understanding of what works, why, how, and for whom, and what doesn't work comes from research. So the SVRI is really about advancing research on violence against women and violence against children in lower middle income countries. And for too long, most research has been conducted in the global north or driven by researchers from the global north about issues that we face here in lower middle income countries. And we really seek to address this inequity by supporting evidence and building up global southern researchers doing research from the global south. We invest in this work through building evidence, grant making, capacity strengthening, and promoting partnerships and working to influence change. And supporting and working with key thinkers in the field on key topics and considering them in different ways, we have had the privilege to do with Abby and Sophie. And I'm really grateful to both you, Abby, and you, Sophie, for being so generous and trusting us with your work. Thank you. I'm not really going to take much more of your time. I just want to let you know that we do have a call to action as the S3RI. Whether you are a researcher, policymaker, practitioner, funder, activist, please join our community of diverse global voices committed to addressing violence against women and violence against children, because we know we cannot do this alone, and collaboration partnerships are essential to building meaningful evidence to end violence against women. So please join us. And I do invite you to come to our next conference in Mexico next year in September 2022. I will paste the link in the chat. You're all invited, and thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to you, Charlie, I think. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Liz. I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for this incredible keynote speech to all three of you, Abby, Sophie, and Liz. Your work is amazing and very inspiring. I can see from the chat that it also resonates with a lot of the people here today in their own experiences and the work that they are doing. I think how trauma leaves an imprint on the body is something that everyone is grappling with, and the strategies for addressing that, well, we could all use more, couldn't we? And it could definitely be incorporated into research in better ways. I suppose one of the things I was just thinking about while you were talking in particular, Abby, was how we might be measuring the complex trauma in our research and interventions. I think a lot of the work that I see is measuring PTSD in interventions quite heavily. It's a major focus, and often measuring trauma, but I see a lot of these measures really oriented towards other kinds of trauma actually, and not the complex trauma that we're talking about. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space still. And I really think supporting researchers from the Global South is a critical thing that we need to do. I think the work of HEART is an incredible space where that's already happening, incredible programs, incredible research, and something that really speaks to me is impacting on the alienation that people feel from their own bodies, something that I don't see happening enough in recovery work with survivors. So really grateful for the work that you do, Sophie, so thank you. I'm going to start asking some questions from the chat. If everyone could post their questions there, please, that would be wonderful. I've got one question so far that says, thank you so much to you, the panelists, to you, the speakers. And they want to know, what are the barriers for implementing these kinds of programs in the Global South as opposed to the Global North? And if you've perhaps observed any differences across these kinds of contexts, or know of any differences across these contexts. So I'll hand over to you, Abby and Sophie.
Sophie, you want to answer? Or
sure, thanks, Abby. I can start, and then yeah, you can fill in any gaps. I mean, I think one of the main barriers that we found is really just around yoga itself, the kind of assumptions that people have around what yoga is, the spirituality behind the practice, and also who it's for, right? So there's a perception both in Uganda and even more so in Cebu in the Philippines, where we're starting to work now, that it's really like a luxury kind of reserved for people with wealth and money and status. And it might, so a woman might be thinking, this isn't really for me. This isn't something that's designed for me. I don't know if I can't really say if there might be some stigma or, pushback against a yoga-based program in other settings, but I imagine there are. I've heard about yoga being used in prisons in the US, for example. And, I imagine that just like any other mind-body practice, there's folks that gravitate towards it and folks that feel like it's more separate from them. And I'll just say that one of the ways that we've worked with this, our lead facilitator, Joyce Nanchiwela, who's Ugandan, she often talks about how, look, you're already doing yoga, whether you know it or not. Every time you take a deep breath, every time you try to reflect inwards and think about how you're feeling, actually that's part of the yoga practice, and that's what we're going to be doing together. So she really tries to demystify it and bring it and bring it into kind of more everyday experiences and relate it to everyday experiences. And that's kind of one of the ways we've worked around it. But to be really honest, I mean, it takes relationships, it takes trust, it takes a lot of kind of groundwork and setting up work to ensure that everyone feels included and welcomed, and that this is something that they want to try out. Then once people start, like, it's kind of as you start to deepen your own practice, what we've seen anyway is that it works, it resonates. People enjoy moving their bodies in this way and they keep coming back, but it's kind of that initial starting point that's a hurdle. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Sophie. And I see Justin's just posted in the chat to say that it works very well in prisons in the UK too, where it's got a great sustainable impact. I mean, I'll hand over to Abby because she was first, and then Elizabeth.
Interestingly, in Nicaragua, I had expected more of the kind of pushback that Sophie refers to, but the truth is, in a lot of Southern countries or of the global South, people don't even really know what yoga is. So there was curiosity and perhaps a bit of uncertainty at the beginning, and more than anything, once starting to move bodies in this way was something that the women were not accustomed to. But I would say the main problem wasn't so much the yoga and acceptance of that, but rather the resources. Not only resources in the way that we typically think about them, of being able to set up programs. Everything was done on a volunteer basis, including the yoga teacher, but even the resources for the people to be able to get to the class. Like, one of the things I had to do was arrange transportation for everybody to come to the class. And since the class was in the evening, I had arranged transportation for everybody to go home, because it's not safe to get onto public transport after a certain hour. So there are a lot of barriers in terms of resources. One of the things I will say that's amazing about yoga is that despite the resource challenges, once the women took part in the yoga practice, it became a skill set that they had available to them on a personal level. And so many times the women have told me that when they're going through periods of greater stress and challenge, that they can turn to these resources. They can practice some poses at home. They'll go into different postures that feel comfortable, and that can become a calming technique that they can use on their own. So but to us, it was much more resource related as opposed to stigma around yoga. And as Sophie said, once the women started doing it, it became something that they just loved.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Sophie. I have a question back to actually Abby and Sophie, just following on the issue of resource mobilization for what is potentially, moving beyond our understandings of what works for survivors of sexual violence or trauma survivors. And I think we struggling to get resources for programs like this in low and middle income countries. And how can we address that? Because I do think it's really important. I think CBT has taken a very important role, but it's not the only tool that we have in our toolbox. And I think that we also as a group, need to start advocating for different approaches and different forms of services for survivors. So Sophie and Abby, would you like to just quickly respond to that? Because I know there's other questions, Shali.
Liz, I think that's such an important point. And, again, like, just being really honest, it has been incredibly hard to mobilize resources for this. And I think in terms of what we need, I mean, I feel like, Liz, you've already said it, more conversations, bringing more people on board, and also pushing the research and the evidence base as well, so that the credibility and the value of integrating mind-body techniques into other mental health promotion, resilience building, these areas of work that are kind of trending, and yet the mind-body practices piece are somehow seen as like nice to have, complementary, but not core and central. And actually, I think, Abby, the research you've presented, what we've been learning from HEART and many other programs like this are showing that these can be really core, even standalone strategies that have equal, if not better, impacts with lower cost and more ease of accessibility. So it's kind of shifting the paradigm a little bit, and I feel like we're getting close. Just have to keep making some noise around it.
I'll just add that in countries that are so poor, like Nicaragua, just having access to any kind of intervention is really the big question. I would say there's the resource side where people don't have access to mental health counseling to start with, or any kind of quality mental health counseling. So that's number one. How do you develop those programs in countries that are so resource poor? And there are, I think, a lot of attitudinal problems. I think that the paradigm of psychology that's been developed in the West is very predominant to all over the world. It's not just a Western conception. This conception has filtered. I was head of a university here, of a psychology program, and just cutting through the attitudes about what is appropriate and suitable ways of dealing with trauma is a big challenge, because these attitudes are very ingrained. So I would say resources and attitudes. And I think the evidence base is critical to be able to show that other things do work. I'd also just like to follow up on one more thing Sophie said, which was this yoga program that I did was also a standalone program. And there's been a lot of resistance and criticism in the Western psychological world about whether or not this is something possible to do. What I will say is that these yoga programs are more complex than a regular yoga program. You're not going into a gymnasium and doing an exercise workout. There's a lot of intention in terms of the cognitive messages that are also part of the postures. So the woman I worked with was a hatha yoga teacher who incorporated messages about grounding and about self-love and about letting out things and taking in things. And those messages were very important. That said, one caveat, which is that I'm a psychologist, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so there was backup provided. So I think that when you're dealing with standalone programs, you have to work hand in hand in some way with people who are experienced, so that when crises do emerge, and they do, because there's a lot of triggering that can happen in yoga, and there's just triggering in life that goes on for the person who's taking part in the program. So having psychological backup, I think, is important. But as standalone programs, I think that offers us also a really great opportunity to be able to scale up some of these programs. It's not hugely scalable at this stage, but I think the more we do, the more we'll do. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we've just got a comment from someone. Fiona has commented, following up on this conversation, to say that she thinks this point about resource mobilization is really key. And they've found that in humanitarian settings, integrating mind-body practices within psychosocial support, for example, in women's and girls' safe spaces, has been possible without pushback from donors. But they'd be really interested in more discussions about this. And as you have been saying now, Abby, this is something we need to really be talking about more. And Sophie, you also saying, we need to speak about it more, build the evidence base, and really discuss it. So that was just following up. I do have another question that's been posted into the chat here on behalf of AS, and they've said they'd be interested to hear if any of you know of any work or people working in the area of medical system trauma, by which they mean people who have already experienced violence and trauma and find any kind of intrusion from those medical systems quite triggering and activating, but are then considered as being difficult or non-compliant, etc. They think that major work needs to be done here, but they wonder whether and how we start, who to connect with, and they think it can include birth trauma, being forced and medicated, coerced. They say, sorry, they hope it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. So thank you. Liz has got her hand up, so hand over to you, Liz.
I know that there's been a lot of work around gynecological care and how much being really hard to go and get good gynecological care, and how it's difficult to find a trauma-trained or trauma-informed gynecologist. And that's a really important barrier, and there needs to be lots more research. The interesting thing about COVID is the increasing understanding of the trauma of ICU and the need to provide post-trauma and post-counselling care for survivors, and the impact of the trauma that experienced during ICU, and the need to address the mental health impacts. So, I mean, COVID is terrible and has made an awful impact on the world, but the learnings that are coming out of it and the impact on us as individuals and as societies, I think we'll be unpacking for years to come. Abby, Sophie, on medical health care and trauma and actually being a survivor. From our work also, just the impact of having, abortion care, or, in South Africa, can be incredibly violent, and coercive medical interventions for survivors, and just the abuse that young adolescents get at the hands of healthcare workers. But remembering also our healthcare workers themselves, many of them have had experiences their own levels of trauma, and that's not cared for at all in our services. We're not trauma informed in any way. I do think if we start to rethink how we care and support for our care workers and promote trauma-informed responses and approaches, we will help increase quality of care. Sophie, Abby?
Yeah, I mean that trauma-informed work is relevant for the whole range of traumatic experience that people go through. My focus has been on sexual violence, but as somebody mentioned, working in prisons and penitentiaries, there's been really effective work done with not only yoga, but other types of body engagement. When I work as an individual mental health counselor, one of the focuses of my work is always getting people to engage their bodies in some forms of activities. It creates a mental space that is so healthy for recovery. It creates a place where people begin to accept the sensations that they're having in their bodies, rather than running from them and being terrified of them. So it makes perfect sense, the idea of doing trauma-informed work, whether it's yoga or another type of body-focused work, following traumas from the medical system, whether that's birth trauma or other types. So I think that this type of work that considers the body's relationship to the mind in recovery from trauma is really critical. It's, everybody doesn't have hidden away traumas that they can't access, but everybody who's been traumatized does have sequelae that are in the body. And so you can function with those, but you can function better once those things begin to be addressed.
Now I've come to the end of our time, and I just want to say again a huge thank you to Abby, Sophie, and Liz for their incredible keynote speech. I see the chat has got so much going on in it. People are really excited by this work and incredibly interested. We've shared links to everybody's work in there. If there are other links, please do share them so that we can post them in there quickly now before everyone goes. We will be emailing everything out. I just, in conclusion, to wrap everything up, I want to highlight that we will be having those 2 arts networking events in December and January, which are on Eventbrite, and we're going to be tweeting about them, and they're also in the application pack, and they'll be coming out in our newsletter that's coming out later in the week. This week, look out for our newsletter. It's going to be exciting and wonderful as usual. And we'll be running another webinar in our ECR lunchtime seminar series in February, and that's going to be on alternative or non-academic career pathways for ECRs, a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about because I think it's really important to prepare ECRs to do things outside of the academy that are equally important and necessary. So more details about that are going to be coming out in the next month or so. And then also have a look on our website and watch the recordings of our previous webinars and this webinar. Angeli is going to pop that in the chat for us if she hasn't already done so. So thank you all so much for coming. It's been really amazing to chat with everyone today, to hear about your work. We thank you so much for your time, which is the most precious resource of all. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and hope to see you next time. Bye everyone. Have a good day or night or morning, wherever you are.